Hi, Bolt here with Chapter 12, the final step, rewriting and editing. So this is the last of our tactical writing stages. I'm going to get the mouse in here. So this is a quote from Joan Didion, well-known writer, that my writing process is a process of rewriting, going back and changing and filling in. In the rewriting process, you discover what's going on, and you go back and you bring it up to that point. And this is a classic part of writing, especially with larger things. As you're doing your writing, you're evolving. Your story's evolving, your ideas, your understanding is evolving. So by the time you're done, you got to go back and rewrite it. That's what rewriting is all about. And so as we look at this, right, we really have to add one more arc in our storytelling twist drawing, which is this editing, rewriting. Once we're done storytelling, we've gone all through this, we've done a red team review, we've now got an understanding of some things we need to fix. Sometimes those are little things, sometimes they're big. We're going back and we're going to rewrite it. So this is an ongoing process. The arc would just keep happening again and again and again until you're happy with where things are. This is the last chapter of the book. Now that I'm done, I'm going to have to go back and I'm going to have to rewrite almost every chapter based on the things I've learned. Going back to the very beginning, right, our tactical writing process stages looked at 60% of this was pre-writing where we figured out stuff, 15% was actually writing, and now 25% of our time should be on rewriting, where we're going to do reviewing, editing, and we're going to go through this. Red team review, we've already talked about reviewing as a separate element when we're talking about some of the teamwork. There's also a big part of rewriting, which is your personal critique and analysis. So we're going to talk about that a little bit more today. So as part of your review, but as part of your personal review, you're going to want to go back and you're going to look at what we'll call critical analysis strategy. You want to go back in, you want to evaluate your argument strength, ensure the arguments are logically sound, supported by evidence, and sometimes this can actually mean doing what are called logic diagrams, where you want to go in and you want to check that each of the things are here. I have this, I have that. If there's a step missing, if I jump from A to C and I miss B, I got to go back and fill it in. So any persuasive essay should be backed by research. You should have the citations and go back and be able to fix that in. This is not uncommon to say, oh, I've got this. Now I want to go back and I'm going to do some more research because I want to back up this statement. You know it's true, but you're not sure, especially you're not sure exactly where you learned it from. You go do research, now you add back in citations. So we did research before we wrote. Now we're going to go back, we're going to do some more research we're going. We want to check for a level of consistency, maintain the consistent tone and style and voice. Right? So if I'm going to have a technical document, I want a formal tone. We talked a little bit this again when we did red team review. When you have multiple people write parts of the document, this is where it really becomes important for checking for consistent tone and style. We want to identify redundancies. We want to remove the redundancies that we have, eliminate repetitive information. But again, we want to keep that in balance because sometimes we put things in multiple places because people don't read the whole thing, so you got to put it together. Repeated benefits, if they're intentional, are fine. If they're not, then remove them. Very often, people, when they see that you're not being, when you're being repetitive, they stop reading. They lose their attention. So you want to analyze the structure and organization, sort of logical sequences, logical flow in an academic article, put it all together. Clarity and precision is actually a very important thing, and it's one of the things that even in red team review sometimes gets missed. Are you being clear, unambiguous messages? Sometimes it's very specific to the domain you're working on. So for a policy brief, you got to make sure you use the right terms. This is tricky when you're writing for an area where you're not the expert, and so you're not sure exactly which word to use. The other part of clarity and precision is some of us, for example me, I have a tendency to have more convoluted sentences, and it could be improved. We'll talk a little bit about improving some of those. An important part of this is of this critical analysis is really having a sort of detachment and objective review. Part of the goal of a red team review is a bunch of other people do this. Sometimes you'll do this by literally saying, I want you to take on somebody else's view, make sure it's aligned with goals and clarity from that person's point of view. So you can have an essay and basically pretend you're somebody else to see what's going on, or a red team review. Intentionally getting diverse views and formal requests is detached and objective. Now, we just talked about redundancy, so in a way this is redundant because a couple weeks ago I talked about red team reviews. The reason I'm bringing it up again is because editing and rewriting is so important, and you do this again and again. So don't view the red team or the reviewing process as once and done at a proposal level. Red team review is a term mostly used in proposals. Any writing can go through this sort of critical analysis. So how do we get detached? Well, one way is obviously somebody else's, but for yourself, if you're doing that, this is really more about your personal stuff. One way to do this is take time and get away, get a fresh perspective. Take 2 or 3 days, do something else, then you come back. You'll be surprised how new it will look to you. You can try and read from another perspective. How would my wife look at this? How would my friend look? Reading it from their perspective, saying how would they view these things can change the way you do it. One of the things I mentioned before, which I do a lot of, is I have stuff read aloud. This will help me spot flow issues, especially if I'm reading at 2 or 3x speed. Then like things that all of a sudden jump, like you can't follow them easily at that speed. If they're well written and connected, you can make sense. But all of a sudden you jump topics. It's like what you're not paying enough attention, you lose something. I'm going to talk a good bit in the chapter and go through many examples here about using ChatGPT as an objective review, right? It's a way of getting some unbiased insights or biased insights, depending on how you view ChatGPT, but they won't be your bias, so they'll different biased insights. You can also try and change your physical environment. I will, for example, often do my reading, my proof listening, while I'm out for a walk or do something where I can gain new perspectives and make me concentrate on things differently. And obviously getting external feedback, which we've already mentioned from the review. So just some examples, right? Targeted feedback. If I give it to somebody and I just say, give me a review, you don't know what you're going to get. So you go in and you ask for particular things. Assign them a role and say, from the point of view of this. So for ChatGPT, it really makes a big difference. Both of these are examples of prompts I could give ChatGPT, prompts I have given ChatGPT when I'm working on proposals, chats that the students in class might use for their proposal efforts to sort of get some suggested improvements. But these same prompts could also be good for a person. If I'm giving it to a reviewer, make sure I tell them what to do, offer feedback and suggestions for improvement, focusing on intellectual merit and broader impacts. Those are NSF's criterion, so I want to make sure I get them in. I can go a little bit farther, or I can ask for a scale of 1 to 10 on each of the suggestions. With ChatGPT, you have to be a little careful if you don't have the paid version, because you can't put the whole document in. You got to go through, so you'll see in the bottom prompt here, I have this idea of basically telling ChatGPT to prompt me for input section until I say done. And then for each section, it's going to do a review, spit out some input, then it'll ask me for another one, and I'll iterate through that. You do have to be a little careful because it's not so good at detecting tone and voice changes across those, but for proposal, and if you're not going to have the paid version, that's all you can do. Even if I have the paid version, some of my proposals are too big for that, so you can't do that. Okay. So part of what we want to do, and again, these can be questions I explicitly ask through a prompt. I want to make sure that I'm looking at my objectives and I'm looking for clarity and alignment. This is one of the things that ChatGPT is not going to do for you because they don't really know your objectives. If you say your objectives in a way and you ask ChatGPT, you can check that they seem textually consistent. But the first part of your review objectives is the clarity and the alignment of the document to those internal objectives, and that's really more difficult. That's beyond the text. You want to look for the consistency in the message, avoid tangents. This is one of the problems I have is I'll run off on tangents. You want one clear single message in most documents. Even if you have 2 or 3 things you can do, they should be very localized if you're going to talk about them at all, but really just try and stick to that one consistent message. You got to have logical alignment, structures, and arguments towards the objectives of what you're trying to do, and you got to make sure again that alignment is there. You got to have a logical, targeted language and tone that's trying to persuade or informative or some mix of both. Are you trying to sound unbiased, present both sides, or are you trying to persuade somebody, in which case that can be okay. What techniques you're doing. Analyze your rhetorical effectiveness, right? So we didn't actually formally introduce rhetoric until the previous chapters, last couple chapters, but you can go back in and say, what do I have? Do I actually have every one of those techniques? How can I make that go back in? I can look for stylistic consistency. Does it match with my objectives? If I'm being informal and I'm submitting a formal proposal, that may not match well. If I'm trying to submit a proposal to a company, how do I match to their style? Make sure there's an effective call to action. There should be articulated desired actions. What's going to happen? If you can't quickly identify where's that call to action, you've got to go back and rewrite this section. And it's funny because you might have planned it and then it didn't happen as you're writing. So go back and be very explicit about looking for your call to action. Everything's got a call to action. What are you trying to get them to do? You can look for the comprehensive analysis, regularly assess the contributions to the objective. Anything you have in your document that isn't really related to the objectives is a chance to reduce it. Very often when writing, right, you can cut the length of it in half by rewriting. Homework assignment students often think, oh, I got to fill this up. Writing more and then editing down is the right approach. Don't write to the length you need. write longer so that as you figure all of this redundant stuff, you can cut down and still make it fit. Sometimes you have to work hard to make it fit, and that can actually take more time, but that's part of the rewriting process. So if I have a persuasive article advocating environmental conversation, right, and somewhere in there I'm talking about something that isn't tied to that story, then I want to go back and assess, can I remove this? Can I make my story more coherent and at the same time reduce material that's not going to help the reader? The less they have to read, the closer you'll generally get to your objectives. But you have to have enough in there for credibility, so you got to find that balance. So how do I validate and improve my message impact? So I said this is one of the things that ChatGPT can be pretty bad at, but there's a couple ways we're going to look at in just a couple seconds to get through this. So you want to evaluate the effectiveness, ensure the communication of the intended message, and then we're going to take whatever feedback we'll get. We're going to iterate that through red team, audience feedback, whatever. Weighing the needs for further edits, balancing edits with timeliness. One of the problems with editing and rewriting is, although I described it as taking up 25%, it can easily expand way beyond that. If you need to edit and revisit, you got to find some balance between edits that are critical and those that to meet the timeline and make sure it's going. But this is one of the reasons you want to plan enough time in your timeline to make sure you're going to get that. You got to understand the times of the cost of revisions, recognize the time added by both reviews and by reanalyzing what goes on. Because of my dyslexia, whenever I edit, I can introduce, we like to joke with my students, right? I can introduce 5 typos with 1 character. It's not quite true, but minimal edits by me, and it has to be proofread again because I will break something someplace and I won't notice it. So you got to recognize the added time that's going to go through every time you go to make edits. So sometimes it's just not worth doing. So the next couple of examples are prompts I could give ChatGPT for very different things. And when I go through this, one of the things I'm going to go through these as examples. It can never answer whether or not these are your objectives, but when it writes a summary, which is one of the things you're going to possibly be asking it to do, it's going to come up with a summary when you do this, right? If that summary doesn't match, then something about your writing did not get captured into that summary, which means something in your article is not doing what you want, right? So the first one of these, you're going to look at like writing, evaluate whether this policy advocacy article effectively persuades the reader to support the new policy on renewable energy. Provide specific suggestions for enhancing its persuasive elements, focusing on argument strength, emotional appeal, and call to action. So this is telling it what you want it to do. You've given it, so you're asking it to analyze from a policy advocacy point of view. You've sort of given a point of view and a role to take on, and to have it make suggestions, and then you can go through. So if you do this, and you're writing such an article, it will tell you the parts of your arguments that are weak. It'll say that what's there. It'll notice whether or not there's an emotional appeal. These are all things within the scope of what it can do. The next one, analyze an article on recent discoveries in quantum physics, assess its clarity, accessibility for general audience, offer recommendations to improve clarity and simplify complex concepts without compromising accuracy. So notice I didn't tell it to analyze like whether or not the article will be accepted. I didn't focus on some things. We'll come back to some examples later. I've asked it on clarity and complex concepts. It can handle some of those things. So you have to understand what your reviewer can do. I'm going to go through these pretty quickly. Review a company menu intended to motivate employees during a restructuring phase. Does it effectively boost morale and convey a positive outlook? Suggest changes to enhance the motivational aspects and ensure a tone of empathy. Again, I'm not actually using this in my company because ChatGPT didn't exist when I was running my company, but this is the kind of thing that I would ask a business partner to do. In fact, I would ask it pretty much this way, looking at it to make sure it's motivating the employees, right? It helps when you're doing this with a business partner because they might know your employees. They know how to motivate. Motivating people is differently. Right? Different people will be motivated by different things. So this is one where ChatGPT will not know your employees. They will not be good at it. But another employee or another person who works with your company might be able to do this. Obviously, this is not going to capture anything about what's the restructuring phase because it doesn't talk about that. So, but it can help you with your tone and motivation and stuff. Next one, assess public health advisory for its effectiveness in educating readers about new health guidelines, check for clarity, accessibility of language, and inclusion of actionable steps, provide feedback how to make it more engaging. Again, you're asking it about how to write certain things, and although I didn't include it for any one of these, you might actually ask it to first summarize, which I should have included, summarize and then do this, right? Because then you can look at the summary to help understand whether or not it's getting it. Review this grant proposal for environmental projects, evaluate its alignments with the funding agency's criterion, clarity of objectives, advise on improvements to increase. This is one you have to be very careful of because the improvements to increase its chance of success is something ChatGPT will give you some ideas about, but can be really, really bad at because it doesn't know the state of the art. It doesn't know what the novelty is. And it doesn't necessarily know exactly what it is you're trying to accomplish on your side. So it might one way of increasing the chance of success might be like to reduce your budget, but that won't necessarily accomplish. So there's a bunch of things you have to be careful of when you ask these questions. But asking the prompt, getting the prompt and getting the answers, well, that gives you a chance to decide what to do. Examining its marketing content for a new gadget, does it effectively highlight the product's unique features and appeal to the target demographic? Offering enhances persuasiveness and appeal, particularly the product description and user benefit sections. This kind of thing from a marketing point of view, it can really help you understand the product's unique features is the dangerous part here because it only knows how unique those is based on its knowledge. And again, its knowledge is this weird structured information gleaned as it builds a large language model. Sometimes it will get those right. Sometimes it will get them wrong, not from an hallucination point of view, but because it doesn't know what's out there, right? It might not know all of the things, and so it might miss important things, what's going on. And again, the target demographics, this is a bad prompt in that sense because nothing here says the target demographics. However, if your document actually said the target demographics would be it. You have to be careful with your prompts to it won't complain that the word target demographics is unknown. But if it's not known, it'll just make some weird assumption that you may not match. So again, whenever you're asking people to review, you have to give them enough information, including ChatGPT. Another business one, analyzes draft performance review. Does it provide balanced and constructive feedback while maintaining a positive, clear, encouraging tone? Recommending ways to ensure it's clear, helpful, specific, and whatever. So one of the problems with this is it can't assess the novelty with respect to state of the art, though sometimes catch overlaps with existing work. Just because it doesn't find something that's the same doesn't mean something is not the same is not out there. That's the kind of thing that can kill proposals and papers. It struggles with long inputs. All of these things, right, didn't say very long. They didn't say what the input was. So normally you give it that prompt and then you give it the block of text. It depends on context. So analysis can be off if it's not given enough context, or if it's in a already weird stated context. This is one of the things that I've already seen enough examples of. I'll be doing one thing in ChatGPT, give it a lot of information, and then I'll go on back to a topic I was working on before, and all the stuff that happened in between, all the stuff that's not relevant to the question I'm asking. I remember what I asked it yesterday. It's in the buffer on my screen if I scroll back far enough, but it's got all this stuff in between. It's not going to remember context. So you got to be very careful about managing that context. Reviewing depends on the role. I, in fact, very frequently will define a very explicit role and tell ChatGPT to do this. In fact, ChatGPT 4 has a sort of a predefined stuff you can do. So I give it a defined role and a writing style and stuff, and this is discussed in the chapter in more detail. But making sure that it knows what it's supposed to be doing from what point of view. Any of the things I went through in those prompts didn't actually have an explicit role. They had implicit roles like review this from a point of view. But if I go back to this, the last one, right, this performance review, right, we're asking for it to, it's clear, helpful. I didn't ask it to analyze it from any potential legal ramifications, but I could have done that. Now would have gotten a very different answer. So one of the things you can recommend is to actually ask it the same thing multiple times with giving it different roles. From the point of view of the employee, from the point of view of the manager, from the point of view of legal. You can ask otherwise the same question, you just cut and paste, and you'll get different analyses. And that's one of the nice things I've found about using ChatGPT as an analysis tool, is I can get a bunch of things. I don't believe everything it says, but it prompts me to go look at things in a different way. And once my mind is, oh, I can see what they're saying there, then I got to decide, do I have the space to fix it? Do I have the time to fix it? And is it worth fixing? Those are all things you want to do. ChatGPT will often lack actual knowledge. So performance review depends on the actual activities the person did. And not having access to that, so it can significantly bias the review. If the person's done super phenomenal, and I asked it to make sure it's balanced, and I had nothing negative, it might say, well, for balance, I got to have some things to improve. Maybe I don't want to do that. So you got to figure out what you really want it to do and what is the real data that you're building on top of. And only then can you really use this. So the art of rewriting is a cyclical, critical process, right? You're going to read, you do some assessment, going through the kinds of things we just talked about, maybe do some in-depth analysis of parts. I'll talk about some editing pieces in a second, but for clarity, coherence, and alignment, certain parts I'm going to spend much more time on, others are sort of more background material. Identify areas that require strengthening. I'm going to edit for improvements. I'm going to implement changes based on the analysis, focusing on strength, consistency, structures, And then I'm going to iterate. I'm going to repeat this as a cycle, revise it. The paper we just submitted to a conference, I listened to it 11 times over the course of 3 days. As we made changes, I'd listen, I'd edit it, we'd go back. And that's just the way you go through this process. And sometimes you're listening and, I'll go through the whole thing and I'll come up with 4 changes. And even though I've listened to it, the next time I might have 8 or 9 different changes. Why? Because every time you go through it, especially when you're thinking about it from a different point of view, it makes you think about things. And that's part of the goal of this iterative process, to cycle through and keep doing this. And you're going to keep iterating until the writing meets your specific goals and desired quality. And when you have a deadline, sometimes you're just like, well, I can get this done before that deadline or not. That's a very important question. Now, all of these are a lot of things I've talked about so far are very high level. But there's also some very low level things you want to do in terms of stuff. And so we're going to go through a sort of editing for content, and then we'll get into smaller things. So again, clarity of purpose. Do I state what I'm doing up front? If I'm not clear, many people try and write, especially tactical writing, is not about a surprise ending at the end. Entertainment can be that way. Our goal is we have a purpose. We're trying to get them to understand. Bottom line on top, get them to understand what's going to happen, and then fill in the details as you go through. Is a much more structured approach for tactical writing. Is each section focused on a main theme? You can have different themes in different sections, but I got to make sure that things are focused. Do I have all of the major points? This is the kind of place where asking ChatGPT to help summarize. If it doesn't catch it, then maybe it's not structured in a way that's going to make it easy for the reader to find. Do I have enough supporting details? Again, these are just sort of a checklist of the things we just went over. Do I have too much stuff that I shouldn't have? What's my flow look like? Have I addressed the key questions? Who, what, when, where, why, and how? We're going to go back to like, did I cover all the significant stuff? And the answer might be no, right? Maybe I never said where, but maybe where's implicit. If I'm doing this project, I don't have to say where I am. I'm here. It's my company. Implications and contributions. Discuss the work's impact and additions to the field. If I'm looking at a proposal, if I'm looking at business, what is it going to do? How am I going to make things better? So these are high-level content things. These take a very detached, high-level view. And really, for half of these things, only you can tell your story. Only you know what your key findings are. Only you know what are the implications, right? So other people can't answer those questions. You can get feedback from them if you tell them, here's what I think I'm trying to say and whatever, or I can ask them to summarize it and look at it. But these really require you can't get a lot of help with this. The next ones are places where you can actually get a lot of help. Paragraph strength, brevity, and clarity. So these are things where there's a bunch of automated tools that can really help you go through this, and they will help you recognize these issues. So focus on topic sentences in Unity, sticking to the main idea. ChatGPT will get this a little bit. Other tools are not so good at this. This one's a little bit higher level. Is the first sentence of a paragraph really the main idea? Or are you using a process where some people do where the first sentence is a kind of connector to the previous one? That can help with flow. I find it better to make the first sentence not a connector, make the last sentence of the previous paragraph a connector, or write it in such a way that you don't need a separate connector. They're both your ideas, and you're connecting the ideas in such a way that the flow works. Again, supporting the main idea, logical development transitions, ensure a natural progression of ideas. All these are things you want to put together. The next couple are things where you really can get help. Streamlining wording phrases, use concise expressions. Can we find a way to condense it? This is something where there's multiple tools for doing this that can help you. For example, within Grammarly, right, it'll actually talk about trying to both condense for clarity and reducing wordy phrases to make things more compact. Remove unnecessary qualifiers, using direct language, using active voice. The bottom one here, right? Making sentences dynamics makes them more engaging in general. Sometimes you want to intentionally use passive voice because you're trying to make it as though you're giving the reader the choice, not you doing it, but you can even do the reader's choice in an active voice. So there's some structural edits following a logical progression. Again, if you've laid out your story, this is probably not something you should be doing through rewriting. For smaller things, when you get to larger things, you figure out, gee, after I've done this, I have to go back and restructure. I actually wanted to have the chapter on editing much earlier, but as I went through it, it's like the natural progression just didn't work because I wanted to go through, here's all the steps of TWIST, then here's a couple of applications before I got to editing. So I ended up changing the structure from what I originally had. So you can change it even later in the game, right? You just got to be careful. And if you've written in sometimes that's easy, sometimes it's hard. How is your unified argument and story, right? Are we going back to the core story? So as you've seen throughout this chapter, I keep referring back to TWIST. I came all the way back to the beginning. That sort of connection in terms of coherence can make your writing overall better. Do you have topic sentences, beginning paragraph with clear topic sentences? Are your paragraph lengths balanced for readability? It's one of my problems. I tend to write very long paragraphs, better to often break it up. Some of the students in the class have had that same problem where they write one paragraph with 3 topics. If you change topics, you change paragraphs, you balance, and then sometimes you have sentences that are only one sentence long and then 2 or 3 furthers. Got to find some balance. 1, 2, 3 is fine. 1 and 10, no, find some way to make that more consistent. Do you smoothly guide the reader between sections, between changing of topics? Tell me that a topic is changing, don't just jump into the new one. And there's some questions for structural edits about visual appeal of the document. You want to manage widows and orphans and size of figures for readability and visual appeal. You don't want a word on line by itself. That doesn't visually look good. It takes an extra line if you're worrying about space. So sometimes you're going to edit sentences just to make all of that stuff where the sentence was fine in terms of logic and everything else, but you didn't want that one line. It's especially bad if you have 1 word or 2 words at the top of a page because of the previous page. The paragraph didn't quite, it flows over. That's a widow and an orphan, right? Those depends on which way is one sentence and then the rest is followed, or is it one lower? Fix those, right? They make it visually better and easier on the reader because their thought doesn't have to transition across the page. And then finally, we can talk about some low-level things of line edits for rhythm and cadence. Again, something that's far more important when we're doing speeches and planned oral communication. Not as common in large documents, except for the intro, maybe the key soundbite phrase, where you really want to make sure that you get the soundbite right. But you're going to talk about mixing sentences, lengths, use of pacing, how do you have a consistent tone, literary devices with musicality, like alliteration and consonants, the whispering winds wove through the world. That makes perfect sense if I'm trying to write something that's trying to engage the audience, if I'm trying to get a visual imagery in them, as I might in a speech. Might not make sense if I'm writing a science proposal from writing. So you got to figure out what literary devices you want to do, but you want something that really sticks with the reader. So that's the last part of editing, in my view. Editing for the sort of structural editing, these are things that happen at the end. Lots of these you can get suggestions from other people because they can be done locally. The more local it is, I look at a small piece of text and I analyze it and make a suggestion. Anybody can help you with that, or lots of people can help you with that. Only you can tell your story. Only you can check the story's alignment with your SMART objectives. That part is where you got to spend your time reiterating and going through. And if you can put together a team where you can get a bunch of people doing different parts, that'll allow you to get your editing and rewriting. But editing and rewriting is often where the story is won. It is not the original story. It's the final story that matters. And as you iterate through that, that can be a really transformative process. I've had some of my most highly cited papers where what we started out in the story and when we first wrote the paper, we were saying A. When we got done, the paper was saying BD, right? Completely changed what we're going to talk about in the story part, even though a lot of it was still the same text, right? Small changes can really change the way the story is perceived by the audience. So that's part of what you're looking at, is putting that all together. So have fun with your edits, and thanks for listening.